There was a question sent in by Sophie, and the question is regarding our urban areas, especially our CBD. If you look at our different areas in our urban settlements, such as Johannesburg or Pretoria. And let's just get straight into this question quickly. The question, if you look at question 2, below is a sketch map showing the land use of a city. Now, we've looked at the hierarchies of different settlements last week's episode. And if we classify a city, what do we know as a city? A city is usually where there's secondary, tertiary activities taking place, quite a few residential areas. But let's just quickly identify what we can see on this map. And they've given us keys to represent certain areas on this map. First of all, we've got the letter A situated over there. As you can see, they mention it's a commercial area. So I reckon because it's a commercial area, it's definitely the CBD. The reason why I can also identify the CBD, you can see that all the main routes follow to this central area, as you can see. So I think I am 110% correct that area A represents the CBD. Now the next key shows us wholesale and light industries. Now if we look at the key that's being used, let's just quickly go and identify them. It's situated right next to the CBD. I just want to use a different color pen. So this is the wholesale area situated next to the CBD. Immediately, if you know your concepts and you look at the urban profile, when we look at industries close to the CBD, we usually see them as light industries. The simple reason for it is because they create less pollution and noise pollution and air pollution. Our heavy industry is usually on the outskirts of cities. Okay. Now, if you look at our next key that's being used on our map, industrial areas, as you can see, it's on the outskirts, situated there. Now, industrial areas, heavy industries. For instance, the waterworks, for example, coal works, electricity works is very good examples of industrial areas. When we move, there's a key right in between these two keys over there, and it says the zone of transition. Now, if you know your concepts, and if you look at the urban profile, we know we can identify the transition zone usually around the CBD. It's also known as the zone of decay. So it's got mixed functions, commercial functions, residential functions. Okay. And then on the right-hand side, the keys that's been represented over there is our 3 different income residential areas. We got high income residential areas, median income residential areas, and lower income residential areas. Very importantly, when we look at, unfortunately, this map doesn't give us great detail of the sizes of the stands, but very easy when they ask you in a map work paper to identify the high income residential areas and the low income residential areas. A very important tip that I can give you, go and look at the stand sizes. I'm going to give you an example, for instance, in Johannesburg. If you look at the stand sizes, for instance, Houghton is a high income residential area, and if you go to suburbs such as Hillbrow, it's a low income residential area. If you look at the property stands, it's so much smaller in comparison to Houghton. And most of the time, we do find our high income residential areas furthest away from the CBD. Now, as you can see, the H represents the high income residential areas over there. The M represents the middle income residential areas. There's another high income, middle income. And the L represents the low income residential areas. Now, before we continue with the questions, just pay attention to the greening projects on the map itself. Now, greening projects can be recreation, or it can be green belts. Now, what is green belts? Green belt areas is usually parks. It's considered no activity, building activity allowed to take place over there. It's there for recreational use for people to enjoy it. For instance, Zoo Lake, Emerentia Dam, a couple of examples in Johannesburg. Now let's quickly go and have a look at our questions that we need to answer regarding this map that was provided for us. Account for the location of the CBD labeled A. Now, when we looked at the map, we can see that the CBD is situated right in the center. It's a central place area. You can see that the majority of all the routes is moving into the direction of the CBD. State 2 characteristics of the CBD. If you look at the central business district, it's usually the highest value of land, very expensive over there, the tallest buildings, and usually a very busy economical hub. Now, if you look at question 2.3, which land use zone occupies the largest parts of the city? Now, just by looking at our map, you can see that if you take the largest part of this map over here, which key represents the majority of areas on this map? And you will definitely agree with me that your residential areas of high income, middle income, and low income residential areas covers the largest part of this map. If you look at question 2.4, land use zone B is a transition zone. Describe 2 factors that gives risen to the urban decay in the zone. The simple reason why is we've discussed it in the previous program. The zone of decay, I just want to quickly clean our map a little bit. And just to show you where the zone of decay is. If you live in Johannesburg, the zone of decay is the area just around the CBD, for instance, Kensington, Yeovil, and Zone-Nodes Valley. Now, the reason why it's a transition zone is because many businesses move away from the CBD and move to OBDs. OBD stands for outgoing business districts. I'm using Johannesburg again as an example, for instance, Sandton. Now, the zone of decay, because it's got mixed functions. We have residential areas, we have commercial properties, and we have light industries. And many times these buildings are dilapidated because many people move away from them because it might be overcrowded. If you look at question 2.5 quickly, greening of cities is becoming increasingly important because of global warming. Now, the first time you were introduced to global warming was in grade 10. What is global warming? Just quickly, excuse me. Let's get the right color pen. What is global warming? If you can remember correctly, the definition for global warming is the increase of Earth's temperature. Now, we know the reason what happens with global warming. We look at a couple of aspects. Temperature of the Earth increases. Why does it increase? Because of human activity. What do? We deforestate. I just want to recap on this. Just revise a bit about it. Just remind you. We deforestate. So when deforestation takes place, what happens? We remove plants and trees to construct buildings. Now, plants help to cool an area down, for example. It produces less, when we remove the plants, there's less oxygen in the air. And what does plants do? It removes carbon dioxide from the air. Increase of temperatures, that's global warming, and because of deforestation, because of artificial surfaces, such as tar road surfaces, etc., and buildings. So what does these do? They actually absorb the heat, creating warmer conditions. But going back to our question, the green belts. Greening of cities is becoming increasingly important because of global warming. What evidence is there that this policy is being implemented? Now, as you can, when we go back to our map, we can see that the key being used over here is the greening projects. So at least the city council tries to provide more green belt areas all over the city map. And what does these green belt areas do? They provide more recreation places with more trees and vegetation. And in return, it will reduce the carbon footprint that we create by consuming so much with the cars that we're driving and with the electricity that we generate. Now, if we quickly have a look at question B, discuss 2 advantages of greening cities. Now, I can think of a number of them, and I'm going to write them down on the bottom of this page. 2 advantages of greening our cities. First of all, it reduces pollution. Like I've mentioned, plants absorbs carbon dioxide, releases oxygen. Secondly, it provides recreation for you and your family to enjoy the parks. To have a family outing, for instance, at Zoo Lake in Johannesburg, families tend to gather there over weekends, having a braai and enjoying themselves. And lastly, it improves morale. Okay. Especially people can, during the lunch break, quickly take a short walk through the greenbelt areas and have a much better sense of improving themselves. One point that I want to add over there is it reduces urban sprawl. Now, we looked at urban sprawl last week. What is urban sprawl, for example? It's when a city continues to grow when it's not being planned by city and town planners. So it reduces urban sprawl and it also reduces overcrowding. Because it's not meant for construction sites to take place, so that means there can't be a bigger influx of people moving to the urban areas. If we look at question 3, now these are just some questions without any figure or diagram provided to us. Now, we've discussed this in our previous lessons as well, but it's an excellent exam question, and you can expect similar questions to this in your exam paper in the end of the year. If you look at question 3.1, what is the movement of people from farms to live in big cities called? Now, what do we know about farms? We know, first of all, it's a rural settlement. And then we know our rural settlements, they focus on what? Primary activities. So the primary activities is mainly mining, fishing, forestry, and farming, fishing, forestry, and mining. I apologize for that. Now, it's mostly primary activities taking place. Now, when we look at urban cities, big cities, what do we focus on? We focus on secondary and tertiary activities. Now, the movement of people from these rural areas to the urban areas is known as the rural-urban migration. Okay. Now, 3.2 suggests 2 push factors resulting in people abandoning, leaving their farms. Now, let's just quickly distinguish once again between pull and push factors. When we look at push and pull, now these factors are the reason why we experience rural-urban migration. What pushes people away from the rural areas? Unemployment. So just imagine you just finished high school. You need to go and look for a job. But unfortunately, there's not many jobs available. The simple reason why is because when we look at the rural areas, they focus on primary activities. Now, let's say, for instance, you live in a rural area where there's basically a farming community. Now, unfortunately, these days and age, many of the farms become mechanized. What does it mean, mechanized? It means they're using machinery that used to do the jobs of people. So not many employment opportunities is available. Another reason that we've got mentioned over here is like disasters, such as droughts or flooding. So all of a sudden, because we've experienced a drought or a flood, it means less employment opportunities will be available. So what's going to happen? It pushes people away from the rural area so they can rather go and live in urban areas because there might be better opportunities for them to find a job. And one of the biggest reasons why we experience people leaving rural areas is because of services. There's a lack of services, meaning proper schooling. So let's say, for instance, you finish matric, you want to go and get a tertiary education. Unfortunately, many rural areas do not have colleges or universities. And when we talk about lack of services, we're not only talking about tertiary education, but we also can discuss electricity, clean drinking water, sewage, and housing. Basically, infrastructure. If you go and visit rural areas, you will find that most of the roads in rural areas still consist of dirt roads. So not proper infrastructure is found in these small hamlets or villages. Now, these are the push factors. So that pushes you away from the rural areas. Now, I just might as well mention the pull factors. Why do you want to move from a small village to an urban area? Better job opportunities. Better services, such as schooling, hospitals, colleges, and better housing. So there's going to be improvement in your standard of living once you move to urban areas. If we go back to the question, suggest 2 push factors resulting in people leaving their farms, like I've mentioned. Now keep in mind, if you look at farmers, for example, we're not only talking about the employees of the farmer, but it might be the farmer himself. If he's experienced a drought, he might decide to sell the farm and move to urban areas, but lack of services such as water. Now, water is very important for farmers. I mean, we're talking about irrigation systems, water transfer schemes, to be able to get the farmer water, to be able to grow his crops. And unfortunately, if he doesn't have that infrastructure, he's going to lack a massive crop result in the end of the day. And that means it's going to be less productive, he won't be able to employ many people, and eventually he might go bankrupt. If we look at question 3.3, state 2 negative effects that this movement is likely to have on cities. Now, our next questions that we're going to answer, I will go in a bit more detail to that. But with the influx of so many people moving from rural areas to urban areas, we experience urban sprawl. Now, what is urban sprawl? I'm going to repeat myself again. It's when urban area gets so much bigger, and it's not in a controlled environment. So it wasn't planned. So it's the unplanned expansion of urban areas. Now, unfortunately, If that happens, it puts huge amount of pressure on infrastructure. It puts huge amount of pressure on service delivery, such as municipalities, because there's a massive influx of people coming in. These people need housing. These people need water. The electricity demand is going to increase. So eventually it's going to create problems in the distant future. Now we've mentioned urban sprawl, overcrowding, too many people in a certain area, and it might lead to unemployment because there's just too many people and not enough jobs, and an increase in crime because unfortunately people won't be able to be sustainable to look after themselves, and they will start creating crime. And lastly, and we're going to discuss it in our next couple of questions, quite important as well, there's a rise in informal settlements. And once again, what's an informal settlement? It's a settlement that lacks basic needs and services such as proper housing, roads, and service delivery. If we go back to question 3.4, now sustainable measures are necessary to encourage people to remain in rural areas. Now what can we do? Some ideas for the government to reduce the rural depopulation. So the question basically asks, what can the government do to make sure that people do not leave these rural areas, for them to stay put? Now, first of all, they can provide better services. When we talk about better services, we can mean water supply, electricity, and housing. While I added, it can also improve services such as healthcare facilities, as well as schooling. And especially to the farmers farming in rural areas, they can be given grants or loans with much smaller interest rates. And the government can also invest in agricultural schools. To teach the people how to farm. Definitely tourism, for instance festivals, can also be used to keep the people there to create employment opportunities.